Translator's Preface. Difference and Repetition was published in 1968. It was Deleuze's principal thesis for the doctorate d'etat. Expressionism in Philosophy, Spinoza, published in the same year, was his accompanying secondary thesis. The Logic of Sense appeared the following year. This interrelated body of writing marks the border between two phases of Deleuze's career. One side facing the earlier texts of an unorthodox historian of philosophy, the other facing his subsequent work, alone and with Guattari. If the study of Spinoza is the more strictly scholarly undertaking, then Difference and Repetition is the first book in which Deleuze begins to write on his own behalf. As such, it occupies a pivotal place in his oeuvre. Difference and Repetition is a work of prodigious conceptual invention, in which Deleuze draws upon his early readings of Plato, Hume, Bergson, Nietzsche, and Kant, as well as elements of contemporary science and art, to weave together a physics and a metaphysics of difference. If this amounts to a critique of the philosophy of representation, which has dominated European thought since Plato, then it does so in the same manner that Anti-Oedipus amounts to a critique of psychoanalysis, namely by proposing a retrospective analysis on the basis of an alternative. The different kinds of multiplicity found in Bergson, the ontology of eternal return understood as the being of that which differs, and a transcendental empiricism of the faculties are among the elements of Deleuze's earlier studies, which are here woven into a systematic philosophy of difference. Representation is replaced by the expression or actualization of ideas, where this is understood in terms of the complex notion of difference/satiation. The system is grounded only in the repetition of difference, or the repetition of ideal problems, which precisely amounts to a non-ground or groundlessness. As befits the exposition of a novel metaphysical system, there is occasionally recourse to neologisms. These include some terms which are Deleuze's own inventions and which I have attempted to render into the appropriate English equivalents, such as a presentation, or the recurrent notion of the disparate, la dispare. A more significant case arises from the need to make a terminological distinction in English where no equivalent exists for the corresponding French terms. Thus, Deleuze makes a significant use of the distinction in French between différencier, to make or become different, and différencier, which is restricted to the mathematical operation. Because of the extent and significance of his use of this distinction, which becomes apparent in Chapter 4, I have had to follow his terminology and introduce differentiate as a term of art in English. On the whole, however, Difference and Repetition achieves its effects by means of no typographical cleverness, no lexical agility, no blending or creation of words, no syntactical boldness. The problems which it poses for the translator are of another order. These include, first, problems raised by the diversity of philosophical languages deployed in the course of this book. For the most part, I have followed the terminology employed in the standard English translations of the primary texts in question. For example, following the authorized translation of Bergson in using extensity for étendue, see Chapter 5. In some cases, however, where standard French terminology differs from the English in ways which relate to important aspects of Deleuze's project, I have followed the French. For example, Deleuze uses the term ideas in standard Platonic or Kantian senses, but then develops his own concept of ideas, which owes as much to Leibniz and contemporary structuralism as it does to Kant or Plato. In order to maintain the continuity in Deleuze's use of this term, I have used the term ideas with reference to Plato in some contexts where standard English translations would use forms. Secondly, in the pursuit of his own distinctive style of philosophizing, which combines an extreme sobriety in the use of language with an extraordinary vitality in the use of concepts, Deleuze often draws upon existing words to create a terminology for concepts of his own making. In some cases, this involves the use of technical terms taken from the sciences or particular philosophies. For example, the term multiplicity, which is now well established in the translations of Deleuze's work, is derived from the French mathematical term multiplicité, used to refer to those Riemannian objects which English mathematicians would call manifolds. In other cases, Deleuze employs apparently ordinary words to designate important concepts of his own making. This is true of point remarquable, which I have rendered as distinctive point. This term has been variously translated as prominent, exceptional, or remarkable point. In fact, there is nothing remarkable about these points. They are the points or pre-individual singularities which distinguish one idea, problem, or multiplicity from another. Initially introduced alongside the mathematical concept of singular point, which is employed to designate those points which characterize or define a given function, distinctive point takes on a life of its own as a non-mathematical term in art in Deleuze's work. It is not to be confused with the distinctive traits referred to by structural linguistics, nor should it be confused with the shining points to which Bergson refers in his discussion of memory, although in this book and in Bergsonism, Deleuze does establish a connection between these two terms. A further difficulty arises in cases where a single word in French has multiple English equivalents. A frequently occurring word of this type is moi, which may be rendered either as ego or self. Here, the attempt to follow standard English terminology has led me to use self in all contexts, except those where it is explicitly a question of psychoanalysis, in which case I have used ego. In this case, readers should be aware that I have maintained continuity with the existing English terminology for particular philosophies, at the cost of introducing a discontinuity into Deleuze's text, which is not present in the original. Another case of this type is the word fond, which may either ground or bottom, which may be either ground or bottom. This term occurs widely in conjunction and opposition with a series of French cognate words, fond, fondement, fondation, as well as the important term sans fond, and Deleuze's own effondement. I have retained Deleuze's distinction between foundation, fondation, and ground, fondement. However, while the French fonder often occurs in contexts in which the appropriate English term would be the verb to found, I have mostly preferred ground in order to maintain the connection with Deleuze's important usage of le fond and fondement. Both of these terms are connected with the philosophical concept which is regularly rendered as ground in English translations of German philosophy, while his notion of the groundless, sans fond, is explicitly linked to the German Ungrund. For this reason, I have also used ungrounding for effondement. This family of terms is further complicated by the occasional play upon fond, bottom or depths, and profond, deep, profound. However, since Deleuze contrasts a concept of depth, profondeur, with that of ground, fond, in chapter 5, I have used ground for le fond throughout. Additional translators' notes on particular points along with references to texts cited have been included in the notes. These are indicated by an asterisk. Many colleagues have read sections, offered assistance, or answered my queries in the course of preparing this translation. In particular, I would like to thank Genevieve Lloyd, Paul Crittenden, Kim Lykos, Paul Tom, and their scholarly assistants, the Dean, Richard Campbell, and the Faculty of Arts at the Australian National University for awarding me a Faculty Research Fund grant. Rex Butler for his considerable efforts as research assistant and reader, Hugh Tomlinson, who suggested that I undertake this task, Konstantin V. Bondas, who sent me his draft translation of the entire text, thereby providing me with an invaluable means of checking the accuracy of my own, Martin Jugan, Timothy S. Murphy, and Amitavo Islam for their comments, and Brian Masumi for his scrupulous and helpful reader's review. I am grateful to Peter Cook for his help with proofreading and printing the final text, and with compiling the index. Throughout the course of this project, I have been fortunate to enjoy the support, encouragement, and scholarly assistance of Moira Gattens. Preface to the English edition. There is great difference between writing history of philosophy and writing philosophy. In the one case, we study the arrows or the tools of a great thinker, the trophies and the prey, the continents discovered. In the other case, we trim our own arrows, or grant those which seem to us the finest in order to try to send them in other directions, even if the distance covered is not astronomical but relatively small. We try to speak in our own name, only to learn that a proper name designates no more than the outcome of a body of work, in other words, the concepts discovered, on condition that we were able to express these and imbue them with life using all the possibilities of language. After I had studied Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Proust, all of whom fired me with enthusiasm, Difference and Repetition was the first book in which I tried to do philosophy. All that I had done since is connected to this book, including what I wrote with Guattari. Obviously, I speak from my own point of view. It is very difficult to say why one becomes attached to a particular problem. Why was it difference and repetition which preoccupied me rather than something else? And why the two together rather than separately? These were not exactly new problems, since the history of philosophy, and especially contemporary philosophy, dealt with them constantly. But perhaps the majority of philosophers had subordinated difference to identity, or to the same, to the similar, to the opposed, or to the analogous. And they had put difference in the concept itself, thereby reaching a conceptual difference, but not a concept of difference. We tend to subordinate difference to identity in order to think it from the point of view of the concept of the subject or the subject. For example, specific difference presupposes an identical concept in the form of a genus. We also have a tendency to subordinate it to resemblance from the point of view of perception, to opposition from the point of view of predicates, and to analogy from the point of view of judgment. In other words, we do not think difference in itself. With Aristotle, philosophy was able to provide itself with an organic representation of difference. With Leibniz and Hegel, an orgiastic representation. It has not, for all that, reached difference in itself. The situation was perhaps no better with regards to repetition. In another manner, this too is thought in terms of the identical, the similar, the equal, or the opposed. In this case, we treat it as a difference without concept. Two things repeat one another when they are different, even while they have exactly the same concept. Henceforth, everything which causes repetition to vary seems to us to cover or hide it at the same time. Here again, we do not reach a concept of repetition. By contrast, might we not form such a concept once we realize that variation is not added to repetition in order to hide it, but is rather its condition or constitutive element, the interiority of repetition par excellence? Disguise no less than displacement forms part of repetition and of difference, a common transport or diaphora. At the limit, might there not be a single power of difference or of repetition, but one which operates only in the multiple and determines multiplicities? Every philosophy must achieve its own manner of speaking about the arts and sciences, as though it established alliances with them. It is very difficult, since philosophy obviously cannot claim the least superiority, but also creates and expounds its own concepts only in relation to what it can grasp of scientific functions and artistic constructions. A philosophical concept can never be confused with a scientific function or an artistic construction, but finds itself in affinity with these in this or that domain of science or style of art. The scientific or artistic content of a philosophy may be very elementary, since it is not obliged to advance art or science, but it can advance itself only by forming properly philosophical concepts from a given function or construction, however elementary. Philosophy cannot be undertaken independently of science or art. It is in this sense that we try to constitute a philosophical concept from the mathematical function of differentiation and the biological function of differentiation, in asking whether there was not a stable relation between these two concepts which could not appear at the level of their respective objects. Art, science, and philosophy seem to us to be caught up in immobile relations in which each is obliged to respond to the other, but by its own means. Finally, in this book it seemed to me that the powers of difference and repetition could be reached only by putting into question the traditional image of thought. By this I mean not that we think according to a given method, but also that there is a more or less implicit, tacit, or presupposed image of thought which determines our goals when we try to think. For example, We suppose that thought possesses a good nature, and the thinker of a good will, naturally to want the true. We take as model the process of recognition. In other words, a common sense or employment of all the faculties on a supposed same object. We designate error, nothing but error, as the enemy to be fought, and we suppose that the true concerns solutions. In other words, propositions capable of serving as answers. This is the classic image of thought, and as long as the critique has not been carried to the heart of that image, it is difficult to conceive of thought as encompassing those problems which point beyond the propositional mode, or as involving encounters which escape all recognition, or as confronting its true enemies, which are quite different from thought, or as attaining that which tears thought from its natural torpor and notorious bad will and forces us to think. A new image of thought, or rather, a liberation of thought from those images which imprison it. This is what I had already sought to discover in Proust. Here, however, in Difference and Repetition, this search is autonomous, and it becomes the condition for the rediscovery of these two concepts. It is therefore the third chapter, which now seems to me the most necessary and the most concrete, and which serves to introduce subsequent books up to and involving the research undertaken with Guattari, where we invoked a vegetal model of thought, the rhizome in opposition to the tree, a rhizome thought instead of an arborescent thought. Preface. The weaknesses of a book are often the counterparts of empty intentions that one did not know how to implement. In this sense, a declaration of intent is evidence of real modesty in relation to the ideal book. It is often said that prefaces should be read only at the end. Conversely, conclusions should be read at the outset. This is true of the present book, the conclusion of which could make reading the rest unnecessary. The subject dealt with here is manifestly in the air. The signs may be noted. Heidegger's more and more profound orientation towards a philosophy of ontological difference, the structuralist project based upon a distribution of differential characters within a space of coexistence, the contemporary novelist's art which revolves around difference and repetition not only in its most abstract reflections but also in its effective techniques, the discovery in a variety of fields of a power peculiar to repetition, a power which also inhabits the unconscious, language, and art. All these signs may be attributed to a generalized anti-Hegelianism. Difference and repetition have taken the place of the identical and the negative, of identity and contradiction. For difference implies the negative, and allows itself to lead to contradiction, only to the extent that its subordination to the identical is maintained. The primacy of identity, however conceived, defines the world of representation. But modern thought is born of the failure of representation, of the loss of identities, and of the discovery of all the forces that act under the representation of the identical. The modern world is one of simulacra. Man did not survive God, nor did the identity of the subject survive that of substance. All identities are only simulated, produced as an optical effect, by the more profound game of difference and repetition. We propose to think difference in itself, independently of the forms of representation which reduce it to the same, and the relation of different to different, independently of those forms which make them pass through the negative. Modern life is such that, confronted with the most mechanical, the most stereotypical repetitions inside and outside ourselves, we endlessly extract from them little differences, variations, and modifications. Conversely, secret, disguised, and hidden repetitions, animated by the perpetual displacement of a difference, restore bare, mechanical, and stereotypical repetitions within and without us. In simulacra, repetition already plays upon repetition, and difference already plays upon differences. Repetitions repeat themselves, while the differentiator differentiates itself. The task of life is to make all these repetitions coexist in a space in which difference is distributed. Two lines of research lie at the origin of this book. One concerns a concept of difference without negation, precisely because unless it is subordinated to the identical, difference would not extend or would not have to extend as far as opposition and contradiction. and the other concerns a concept of repetition in which physical, mechanical, or bare repetitions, repetition of the same, would find their raison d'etre in the more profound structures of a hidden repetition in which a differential is disguised and displaced. These two lines of research spontaneously came together because on every occasion these concepts of a pure difference and a complex repetition seemed to connect and to coalesce. The perpetual divergence and dissentering of difference corresponded closely to a displacement and a disguising within repetition. There are certainly many dangers in invoking pure difference, which have become independent of the negative and liberated from the identical. The greatest danger is that of lapsing into the representations of a beautiful soul. There are only reconcilable and federative differences, far removed from bloody struggles. The beautiful soul says, "We are different, but not opposed." The notion of a problem, which we see linked to that of difference, also seems to nurture the sentiments of the beautiful soul. Only problems and questions matter. Nevertheless, we believe that when these problems attain their proper degree of positivity, and when difference becomes the object of a corresponding affirmation, they release a power of aggression and selection which destroys the beautiful soul by depriving it of its very identity and breaking its goodwill. The problematic and the differential determine struggles or destructions in relation to which those of the negative are only appearances, and the wishes of the beautiful soul are so many mystifications trapped in appearances. The simulacrum is not just a copy, but that which overturns all copies by also overturning the models. Every thought becomes an aggression. A book of philosophy should be in part a very particular species of detective novel, in part a kind of science fiction. By detective novel we mean that concepts with their zones of presence should intervene to resolve local situations. They themselves change along with the problems. They have spheres of influence where, as we shall see, they operate in relation to dramas and by means of a certain cruelty. They must have a coherence among themselves, but that coherence must not come from themselves. They must receive their coherence from elsewhere. This is the secret of empiricism. Empiricism is by no means a reaction against concepts, nor a simple appeal to lived experience. On the contrary, it undertakes the most insane creation of concepts ever seen or heard. Empiricism is a mysticism and a mathematicism of concepts, but precisely one which treats the concept of an object, of an encounter, as a here and now, or rather as an erewhon, from which emerge inexhaustibly ever new, differently distributed heres and nows. Only an empiricist could say, concepts are indeed things, but things in their free and wild state, beyond anthropological predicates. I make, remark, and unmake my concepts along a moving horizon, from an always decentered center, from an always displaced periphery, which repeats and differentiates them. The task of modern philosophy is to overcome the alternative temporal/non-temporal, historical/eternal, and particular/universal. Following Nietzsche, we discover as more profound than time and eternity the untimely. Philosophy is neither a philosophy of history nor a philosophy of the eternal, but untimely, always and only untimely, that is to say, acting counter to our time and thereby acting on our time, and let us hope for the benefit of a time to come. Following Samuel Butler, we discover erewhon, signifying at once the ordinary nowhere and the displaced, disguised, modified and always recreated here and now. Neither empirical particularities nor abstract universals. A cogito for a dissolved self. We believe in a world in which individuations are impersonal and singularities are pre-individual. The splendor of the pronoun one wants the science fiction aspect which necessarily derives from this erewhon. What this book should therefore have made apparent is the advent of a coherence which is no more our own, that of mankind, than that of God or the world. In this sense, it should have been an apocalyptic book. the third time in the series of times. Science fiction is yet another sense, one in which the weakness becomes manifest. How else can one write but of those things which one doesn't know or knows badly? It is precisely there that we imagine having something to say. We write only at the frontiers of our knowledge, at the border which separates our knowledge from our ignorance and transforms the one into the other. Only in this manner are we resolved to write. To satisfy ignorance is to put off writing until tomorrow, or rather, to make it impossible. Perhaps writing has a relation to silence altogether, more threatening than that which it is supposed to entertain with death. We are therefore well aware, unfortunately, that we have spoken about science in a manner which was not scientific. The time is coming when it will hardly be possible to write a book of philosophy as it has been done for so long. Ah, the old style. The search for new means of philosophical expression was begun by Nietzsche, and must be pursued today in relation to the renewal of certain other arts, such as the theater or the cinema. In this context, we can now raise the question of the utilization of the history of philosophy. It seems to us that the history of philosophy should play a role roughly analogous to that of collage in painting. The history of philosophy is the reproduction of philosophy itself. In the history of philosophy, a commentary should act as a veritable double, and here the maximal modification appropriate to double. One imagines a philosophically bearded Hegel, a philosophically clean-shaven Marx, in the same way as a mustached Mona Lisa. It should be possible to recount a real book of past philosophy as if it were an imaginary and feigned book. Borges, we know, excelled in recounting imaginary books, but he goes further when he considers a real book such as Don Quixote, as though it were an imaginary book, itself reproduced by an imaginary author, Pierre Menard, who in turn he considers to be real. In this case, the most strict repetition has at its correlate the maximum of difference. The text of Cervantes and that of Menard are verbally identical, but the second is almost infinitely richer. Commentaries in the history of philosophy should represent a kind of slow motion, a congelation or immobilization of the text, not only of the text to which they relate, but also of the text in which they are inserted, so much so that they have a double existence and a corresponding ideal, the pure repetition of the former text and the present text in one another. It is in order to approach this double existence that we have sometimes had to integrate historical notes into the present text.